Hi, my name's Findlay Ross. I'm the Director of Production for J&D Mitchell, which includes overseeing Glengyle Distillery here. Come on in.
So my name's Findlay Ross. I'm the Director of Production at J&D Mitchell, which includes overseeing Glengyle Distillery. What was I going to say? Studied chemical engineering as an undergraduate, then I worked for a couple of years as a process engineer in the food industry. Didn't really find it that interesting, so did a postgraduate in brewing and distilling. After that, I managed a brewery for about 3 years before a job came available working in the sales team down here in Campbelltown. I actually started with Cadenheads in 2015. About 3 months into that job, it became apparent that the company wanted to fill the Director of Production position. It had been left vacant since Frank McCarty left, and I was honoured to be offered that and obviously accepted it. There's a lot of challenges that come with the role. I think probably the biggest one is trying to make sure that we're continually developing people, developing the site, investing in people, investing in the site, but without compromising the traditional methods and the quality of the product that we've got here. So anytime we think about trying to make changes or improve something, we always ask ourselves, is this going to have a direct impact on the quality of the final product, or is it going to change it in any significant way? And if the answer to that is yes, then we won't do it. But I think the fact that it's less prevalent here, but at Springbank, it's a very old distillery, it takes a lot of maintenance to keep it up and running. The challenge with producing up at Glengyle is that we only produce about 3 months of the year. So for the other 9 months, we've got to make sure that the distillery is maintained as best as possible so that when we do come back up here, the distillery is ready to go straight away. Well, things break down a lot less up here than they do at Springbank, so that's a big plus. But no, in all seriousness, the thing I love about coming up to Glengyle is that our production period here normally starts in mid-September. So to me, that's just the symbol of the end of summer and coming into the autumn and winter period. And we squeeze a lot in here in the 3 months that we produce. The setup of the distillery is really different from Springbank, but it's really interesting, and I love the way it's been laid out. I'm not a religious person, but when you come up the stairs from the mash tun and look down towards the stills behind us, it's got that kind of feel of some kind of really important site, especially with a historical building. It's an aisleway that carries you down to the main feature of the stills. Things are done a little bit differently up here, but they're all still done with the quality of the product in mind. So the slow fermentation times, the slow distillation periods, they all contribute to producing a really, really interesting, high quality whisky. Well, to me, the Kilkerran you make it's very light, very fruity. There's a little bit of oiliness and obviously a little bit of peat, but given that the line arms up here at Glengyle are upwardly facing and there's a little bit of a higher reflux rate, we tend to find that it is just that little bit lighter, a little bit probably less peaty than you maybe expect in comparison to a similar kind of jam like Springbank. Well, I can't take any credit for the heavily peated range inception. That had started before I joined the company, but once it became apparent that we had a really good, high quality, heavily peated malt, and obviously having tasted the new make and the whisky as it was about 1 to 2 years old at the time, we knew that we had something that was really, really interesting, and also something that we could maybe start to look at tasting and bottling at a younger age than we might have expected, just due to the quality of the product. So for our normal Kilkerran malt, that's all produced up at Springbank Maltings. It's exactly the same process as producing the Springbank malt. So the peat for that, the dry peat comes from St Fergus Moss, and the wet peat actually comes from Springbank Farm in Inverness. So both of them come from the northeast of Scotland. with regards to our heavily peated malt that we've been using for the last few years here, unfortunately the malt flows a couple of years ago were out of commission. We had to get them completely, pretty much stripped back and built back up from the ground again. So we were left with the conundrum of having no malt and potentially no production in that year. So I spoke to Mr. Wright, the owner, and we agreed that we would do some production up here at Glengyle using malt that had been purchased in, and so that was purchased from Beard's Malton up in Inverness. Got it to be peated to a similar kind of ppm, as close as we could get it to, and the characteristics of that are very, very similar to the stuff that we're producing here ourselves anyway. So with regards to producing the first batch, I mean, I think it's fairly famous now that the first batch was tested and it was at 84 ppm. As I say, I wasn't here when that was produced. I could only chat to the guys who were and look through the production records, but the big thing was about making sure that we were getting as much peat week as possible in those first 12 hours, and making sure that we weren't drawing the smoke through the bed too quickly. So it was all about just generating as much peat week as possible and making sure that it was in contact with the malt for as long as it could be before it came through the top, just to make sure that we could get as high a phenol content as possible. I've never used Campbelltown peat in the time I've been here. I think there is some records of Campbelltown peat being used. Obviously way back all the peat used would have been from the local area, but I think it was under Frank McCarthy's time they did an experiment where they got some peat cut out from the peat bogs and brought it in and used it for, might even have been for a local barley. And the story goes that they used it the way they would normally do with the bought-in peat. And by the end of the kilning process, due to the high sand content of the peat, it was effectively like taking a sheet of glass out of the kiln, and I don't think they got too much back from it either. So that was the start and the end of that experiment, as far as I'm aware. Well, it's a bit of a simplistic way of looking at it, but obviously Springbank Distillery has been operational since 1828. Very old school, very traditional. Everything that's set up there, a lot of it, dates back at least 100 years. Even a lot of the mechanical equipment's kind of 50, 60 years old. So if you ask any of the guys who work there, there's a lot of work involved in producing Springbank just from a manual point of view, whether that's from the maltings or even right the way through to the different number of levels and different rooms the guys have to jump around from in order to keep an eye on everything. Whereas when you come up to Glengyle, as you can see behind me, the stills, so the washbacks just to the left, and just behind you guys there is the mash tun and the hot liquor tanks. The malt storage is just in the building right next door. Everything's pretty much on the same level and it all flows in a very linear pattern, which makes it much easier to keep an eye on everything, but also just from a process point of view, it's very easy to track it through and make sure we can identify valves and pipes and that kind of thing, whereas it's a little bit more of a labyrinth down at Springbank. I would absolutely love to increase production up here. It's been something that's been on the agenda pretty much ever since I started. We have actually increased production a fair bit, even in the time that I've been here. We used to do about 55,000 litres of alcohol a year when I first started back in 2015, up to now when we do just about 100,000, somewhere between kind of like 95 and 100,000 is what we aim for. The biggest problem we've got, and the biggest barrier to that, is that it's the same mashmen and stillmen that work at Springbank that also work here. So any increase in production up at Glengyle would eat into our production at Springbank Distillery, which is obviously something we don't want to do. And it takes a long time to train people to be able to do everything that needs to be done to produce the high quality single malts that we do. So we're really at a crossroads where we're going to have to look at taking on and training more staff to be able to really increase the production up here, which is something we're hoping to do, but it's not something that can be done very quickly. It takes a minimum of 6 months to teach anybody the basics and years for anybody to master it. So that's the biggest barrier just now. Yeah, we've got a few interesting products coming up. Glengyle is one of these distilleries where we're experimenting, but more than experimenting with casks. We tend to leave the cask makeup fairly rigid, but we will experiment with the distillation methods. So in the coming year, we've got our Kilkerran 16-year-old coming out. So Kilkerran was 16 earlier on in the year, so to mark that occasion, we're going to release a 16-year-old Kilkerran Single Malt, which is mainly bourbon matured, which I think works really, really well with the kind of light fruity character that we get here up at Glengyle. It complements it really well. We've also got the next batch of heavily peated, which is on the agenda, so that's a really interesting thing, even from us, to be able to track the progress of that and see how the different batches are changing and what the variations are. So we're really looking forward to that coming out onto the market. And as usual, we've got our 8-year-old cask strength, which will be 100% sherry matured again this year, which is something that's been really well received. Certainly the batches we've produced so far and the sherry cask whisky that we're using seems to work really, really well, especially at that 8-year-old stage, so I'm pretty excited about that. In terms of experimentation, normally we'll play around with the malt varieties, so we've done everything up from 0 ppm up to 84. We'll play around with the distillation methods as well. So generally speaking, it's a double distillation up here, but in 2006 there was an experiment to do triple distillation. In fact, I believe if you were to speak to Sir Frank McCartney, he would tell you their aim was to do quadruple distillation, and it never quite got that far. So we revived that last year in terms of doing a variation of triple distilled, which is a little bit more complex when you've only got 2 stills, but that's the kind of thing we like to play around with up here. Generally speaking, we keep the cask ratio usually bourbon and sherry in a fairly even manner. We will occasionally do some different cask types, but generally speaking, if we're going to change or play around with anything up here, it's through the distillation methods to produce a different product. So producing the double distilled Kilkerran is fairly simple. It's just a case of we've got a wash still, we've got a low wine still. We produce low wines from the wash distillation, mix them together with faints from previous runs, and then do a spirit run in the low wine still. We've got a couple of ways to get our spirit from there. That's as traditional as it gets with Scotch whisky, really. Triple distillation is a little bit more complex, partly because we've only got 2 stills, but the other reason it's a bit more complex is we've got a lot less vessels and chargers up here than we do at Springbank, so that really limits where we can send different things to at different times. So it means that when we do triple distillation, we're only able to do 3 mashes of that in a 1-week period, whereas we would normally aim to do 5 with the double distilled. And that's just because when we do a wash distillation and the low wines go into the low wines and faint receiver, that's the only tank we've got for that. So when we use that to charge the low wine still, when we do our faint run to produce the second part of it, we have to make sure that that's completely empty before we can start the next wash distillation. And likewise, when we do our spirit run on the low wine still, so the third distillation, when we take our cut, it's going to the ISR, but when we're doing our heads and our tails, they're going back into the low wines and faint receiver, so we can't have that mixing with a distillation from the wash still. So it's all about timings, and everything's a bit elongated when we do triple distilled. As I say, it means we can produce a lot less in a week. Normally we'd look to make maybe about 7,500 to 8,000 litres of alcohol up here when we do normal Kilkerran. When we do triple distilled, we were down at about maybe 3,500 to 4,000, just because of that reduction in the number of mashes that we can use, but also because every subsequent distillation is reducing the overall volume that we're getting out the other end. So it takes a bit longer, we get a bit less out of it, but the product itself is really, really interesting, quite different from Kilkerran, and really light. We know that the 2006 stuff produced an amazing whisky, even at kind of 14 years old now, so we're hoping for something similar out the back of that. You have to go a long way to beat Kilkerran 12-year-old, to be honest. It sounds a bit sad, but it's my go-to dram at home. It's the one I'll crack open if people come to visit. I just love the fact that it's got all the Campbelltown characteristics, the oiliness, a little bit of salt, that little bit of peat, but I just love the fact that it's a bit more heavily bourbon influenced, really brings forward all the sweetness and the fruitiness from the new make spirit. that being said, this year we're going to bring out our Kilkerran 16-year-old, and to be honest, I think it's got a pretty good chance of knocking the 12-year-old off my number one spot. So I've got a sample of it here. It's again very heavily bourbon influenced. In fact, it's almost entirely bourbon casks. There's a couple of refill casks in there, but generally speaking, most of the driving force is the bourbon cask maturation, and I just think it's fantastic. It's really interesting for us to be able to track the progress of Kilkerran. So we've known for a few years now what 12-year-old Kilkerran tastes like, but for us to be able to see what a 16-year-old tastes like now, and hopefully older age statements as the distillery ages and the casks age, that's one of the most exciting things really about having a distillery that is only 16 years old, is to be able to track all these different age statements through and see what this product's like as it gets older. Well, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're enjoying yourselves at the Whisky Exchange Whisky Show. Slange.